Imagine a satellite, once a vital part of global communication, now lifeless and drifting in space. It spent years beaming signals back to Earth, helping us navigate, predict weather, and even stream videos. But now, its mission is over. What happens next? Does it burn up in the atmosphere? Does it crash into Earth? Or does it end up in some kind of space graveyard? The answer is both fascinating and a little eerie, because just like ships, planes, and even people, satellites and spacecraft have their own final resting places. From fiery re-entries to deep-sea burials, space agencies have developed different ways to handle dead satellites. And as space fills up with more junk, managing these floating corpses has become more important than ever. So, where do dead satellites go? Let's find out. Look up at the night sky. It might seem like a vast, empty void, but in reality, Earth's orbit is crowded. Right now, there are thousands of operational satellites circling our planet. But for every functioning satellite, there are countless pieces of space junk, dead satellites, broken rocket parts, and debris from past collisions. And the number is growing. According to NASA, there are over 100 million pieces of debris in orbit, ranging from tiny paint chips to massive defunct satellites. At least 36,000 of those objects are larger than 10 centimeters, big enough to cause serious damage if they collide with something important. And here's the scary part. These objects are moving at insane speeds. The average speed of orbital debris, 17,500 miles per hour, 28,000 kilometers per hour. That's faster than a speeding bullet, almost 7 times faster in fact. At those speeds, even a tiny bolt can punch a hole through a spacecraft. This isn't just a hypothetical problem. In 2009, an old Russian satellite, Cosmos 2251, crashed into a functioning US satellite, Iridium 33. The impact destroyed both satellites and scattered thousands of new debris pieces into orbit. That debris is still up there today, threatening other spacecraft. And then there's the worst-case scenario, Kessler syndrome. This is the doomsday chain reaction that scientists fear. If one major collision sets off another, and then another, Earth's orbit could become so full of debris that space travel becomes impossible. Imagine satellites colliding like dominoes, turning our planet's orbit into an impassable junkyard. That's why space agencies take spacecraft disposal very seriously. They can't just leave satellites to drift forever. Instead, they have to decide how to safely get rid of them. Some satellites burn up, some are sent to a distant orbit, and others, well, they have a very specific burial site. A spacecraft cemetery exists right here on Earth. But before we get to that, let's look at the different ways we say goodbye to these machines. Option 1. Burn up in the atmosphere. One of the simplest ways to dispose of a dead satellite is to let it burn up as it re-enters Earth's atmosphere. If you've ever seen a shooting star, you've already witnessed something similar. That bright streak across the sky? It's usually a tiny rock burning up as it falls toward Earth. Satellites, however, are much larger, but the same basic principle applies. When a satellite's mission ends, engineers can program it to slowly lower its orbit until gravity takes over. As it falls, the intense heat and friction from the atmosphere cause it to break apart and disintegrate. Most small and medium-sized satellites vanish completely before they ever reach the ground. But there's a problem. Not everything burns up. Larger spacecraft, especially ones made of heat-resistant materials, can survive re-entry. In 1991, pieces of the Soviet space station Salyut 7 rained down over Argentina and Chile after an uncontrolled re-entry. In 2001, parts of the Russian Mir space station, a 140-ton behemoth, plunged into the Pacific Ocean after a controlled descent. NASA's Skylab, a massive space station from the 1970s, had a more dramatic ending. In 1979, it made an uncontrolled re-entry, with chunks of debris landing in Western Australia. Some pieces were large enough to be identified, like a several hundred-pound oxygen tank. In fact, an Australian town even fined NASA $400 for littering they never paid. To avoid these risks, Modern satellites are designed with controlled destruction in mind. Engineers choose materials that melt easily on re-entry. Some even include built-in propulsion systems to help steer them towards safer crash zones. But what happens when a satellite is too big to safely burn up? That's when agencies turn to another option, sending it somewhere far, far away. Option 2, the graveyard orbit. Not all satellites can be dropped into Earth's atmosphere. Some orbit too high, making re-entry impractical or even dangerous. For these, space agencies use a different solution. They send them to a graveyard orbit, a kind of cosmic junkyard where dead satellites remain forever. This orbit sits about 300 kilometers, 186 miles, above geostationary orbit, the zone where satellites remain fixed above one point on Earth. Geostationary satellites are used for communications, weather tracking, and broadcasting. When they die, they can't just stay put. There's limited space in that orbit, and new satellites need to take their place. So, engineers fire a final command, a disposal burn. This tiny push nudges the satellite into a higher, deserted orbit. Here, with no risk of interfering with active satellites, it becomes a ghost ship, floating silently, possibly for thousands of years. Some famous satellites rest in this orbit. The EchoStar 3, a communications satellite retired in 2017, was supposed to move to the graveyard orbit, but failed halfway through, becoming a dangerous piece of space junk instead. More successfully retired was the Intelsat 701, which was carefully moved to the graveyard in 2016 after 23 years of service. Why not just bring these satellites down instead? Simple: fuel. Satellites operate on limited fuel reserves, and burning enough to re-enter Earth's atmosphere would require too much energy. It's easier and safer to push them away from active space. But graveyard orbit isn't a perfect solution. It's still filling up, and these abandoned satellites could someday become problems if we need that space for future missions. That's why, for many low-orbit satellites and larger spacecraft, there's a more extreme solution: a watery grave on Earth. Option 3, the deep sea spacecraft cemetery. When space agencies need to make absolutely sure that a falling spacecraft won't hit land or people, they aim for one specific place on Earth: Point Nemo. Located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Point Nemo is the most isolated place on the planet. The closest humans to this spot aren't on land. They're usually astronauts aboard the International Space Station, orbiting 400 kilometers, 250 miles above. This makes Point Nemo the perfect dumping ground for spacecraft. Since the 1970s, over 260 spacecraft have been sent to their watery grave here. These include cargo ships from the International Space Station, satellites, and even entire space stations. Mir, the 140-ton Russian space station, was carefully guided to crash into Point Nemo's waters in 2001. Why this location? Because it's 2,688 kilometers, 1,670 miles, from the nearest land. Space agencies calculate the exact angle and speed needed to ensure that the wreckage lands right on target. But not everything that crashes into Point Nemo is planned. In 2018, China's Tiangong-1 space station made an uncontrolled descent. Scientists knew it would land somewhere in the Pacific, but they couldn't predict exactly where. Luckily, most of it burned up, and the remaining fragments ended up in the ocean without causing harm. With more spacecraft retiring each year, Point Nemo will continue to fill up. One day, it could become an underwater museum of space history. Space junk isn't just an inconvenience, it's a major risk to future space missions. With thousands of dead satellites and millions of debris fragments orbiting Earth, scientists are searching for ways to clean up the mess before it gets worse. One idea is to capture debris with nets or harpoons. The European Space Agency, ESA, tested this in 2018 with removed debris, a small satellite that successfully threw a net around a piece of test debris. Harpoons could work the same way, firing at rogue space junk and pulling it into a controlled orbit for disposal. Another approach, lasers. Some researchers propose using ground-based or space-based lasers to gently push debris out of orbit. Unlike sci-fi weapons, these wouldn't blast objects into pieces. That would just create more junk. Instead, the lasers would heat one side of the object, changing its trajectory enough to send it into Earth's atmosphere, where it burns up. In 2025, ESA plans to launch ClearSpace 1, a robotic spacecraft designed to grab and deorbit a piece of old rocket debris. If these cleanup efforts succeed, we could prevent a catastrophic chain reaction like Kessler syndrome. But with new satellites launching every year, the battle to keep space clean is just beginning. If space junk continues to pile up, we could face a future where space travel becomes too dangerous. Imagine astronauts trying to launch into orbit, but being surrounded by a cloud of high-speed debris. Every mission would become a game of chance, dodging thousands of uncontrolled objects just to reach space safely. Even satellites we rely on every day, those that power GPS, weather forecasts, and global communications, could be at risk. A major collision in low Earth orbit could knock out critical systems, affecting everything from airline navigation to financial transactions. Worst of all, if too much debris builds up, we could trap ourselves on Earth. Could we recycle space junk? Instead of letting satellites drift forever or burn up in the atmosphere, what if we could recycle them in space? Some scientists believe the future of spacecraft disposal isn't about destruction. It's about reusing materials already in orbit. One idea is in-space manufacturing. Companies like Made in Space are developing 3D printers that work in microgravity. If we could collect dead satellites and melt down their metal parts, we could use that material to build new spacecraft right in orbit. This would cut down on launch costs and reduce the need to send raw materials from Earth. Another concept is refueling old satellites. Right now, once a satellite runs out of fuel, it's done. But what if we could send up a gas station in space? NASA and private companies are already testing satellite refueling technology, which could extend the life of expensive satellites and reduce the number of dead ones cluttering orbit. Even abandoned spacecraft could become valuable resources. Future missions might repurpose old satellites for spare parts, creating a kind of scrapyard in space. Instead of treating dead satellites as trash, we could turn them into building blocks for future missions. These ideas are still in early development, but they offer a glimpse of a future where space junk isn't a problem. It's an opportunity. If we can recycle what's already in orbit, we might never need another spacecraft cemetery again. While most satellites meet their end quietly, some spacecraft burials are legendary. From entire space stations to high-profile missions, these wrecks mark milestones in space exploration. One of the most famous spacecraft burials happened in 2001, when the Mir space station was guided into the Pacific Ocean near Point Nemo. Mir had been in orbit for 15 years, hosting cosmonauts and astronauts from around the world. But by the late 90s, it was outdated and becoming too expensive to maintain. Instead of letting it drift as space junk, Russia decided to bring it down in a controlled crash. Engineers calculated the perfect re-entry path, ensuring the 140-ton structure would break apart safely before hitting the ocean. Most of it burned up, but some fragments, including pieces of solar panels, sank to the ocean floor. Then there's Skylab, NASA's first space station. Unlike Mir, its end wasn't planned. Launched in 1973, Skylab was supposed to stay in orbit for years, but increased solar activity heated Earth's atmosphere, causing it to expand. This created more drag on Skylab, pulling it downward faster than expected. By 1979, NASA realized it couldn't keep the station in orbit. The problem? They had no way to control its descent. Skylab re-entered the atmosphere on July 11, 1979, and scattered debris over Western Australia. Some pieces were large enough to be identified, including a fragment of its oxygen tanks. Right now, every satellite and space station has 3 possible fates: burn up, be buried in the ocean, or drift forever in a distant orbit. Spacecraft cemeteries, whether deep in the Pacific or high above Earth, help keep our planet's orbit safe. But as space gets more crowded, we need better solutions. If we don't act, we risk turning Earth's orbit into a dangerous minefield that could block future missions. But if we innovate through cleanup missions, recycling, or smarter designs, we can keep space open for exploration, science, and discovery. Every dead satellite tells a story of human progress. And if we manage space junk wisely, future generations might look back at this era not as the time we filled space with trash, but as the moment we figured out how to clean it up.